welcome to our deep dive. You're ready to explore Emily Nagoski's Come As You Are.
Oh, yeah, a book that's been like a revelation for so many when it comes to, women's sexuality and sexual well-being.
Yeah, exactly. It's um
Definitely a must read.
it's a must-read.
Yeah, for anyone who wants to kind of move beyond all those like outdated myths and embrace a more, nuanced and like science-based view of women's experiences.
One of the things that struck me right away was this whole concept of homology.
Right.
This idea that male and female genitals are actually made from the same basic parts, just organized a little differently. It's
Yeah.
kind of a simple idea, but so powerful.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
It's kind of brilliant because it just like totally reframes how we think about variation. So instead of seeing differences as abnormalities, like homology just highlights that variations are natural and expected.
Totally.
And like just thinking about it from a societal perspective, imagine the impact if we had always acknowledged the clitoris's role in pleasure.
Oh, yeah. I mean, how much shame and misinformation could have been
Yeah.
avoided.
That's a really good point. It makes you realize how much like cultural baggage we carry around when it comes to sex,
Absolutely.
especially for women.
Yeah. And Nagoski doesn't stop at anatomy. She extends that homology concept to desire, arousal, and orgasm,
Oh, wow.
suggesting that these experiences are also made of the same fundamental parts, just expressed differently in men and women.
So, if the building blocks are essentially the same, what accounts for the differences in how those experiences actually manifest?
That's where the dual control model comes in.
Okay.
It's this really fascinating framework that explains how our brains have these two systems at play,
Mhm.
the accelerator and the brakes.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Okay.
Break it down for us.
So imagine your sexual response like a car.
Okay.
Okay, so the accelerator, or the sexual excitation system,
Okay.
responds to things your brain has learned to associate with pleasure and arousal. Those sexually relevant stimuli.
And then you have the brakes, the sexual inhibition system, which gets triggered by anything perceived as a potential threat or a reason to like avoid arousal.
So it's this constant interplay between wanting to go for it and hitting the brakes.
Exactly.
What determines how sensitive we are to each system?
Well, Nagoski points out that these responses are largely learned. They're not innate.
Interesting.
And she uses these fascinating rat studies to illustrate this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so in one study, male rats were trained to associate the smell of lemons with sex.
Lemons.
With sex.
Interesting.
Can you guess what happened?
Did they start chasing after lemons instead of female rats?
Pretty much.
Wow.
They developed a strong preference for like lemony females.
That's wild.
And it wasn't just like a quirky preference. It demonstrates the power of learned associations in shaping sexual behavior, even overriding like basic instincts.
Yeah.
Pretty powerful.
Yeah, it is pretty wild. But what does that tell us about human sexuality?
It highlights how much our experiences and cultural conditioning influence what we find arousing or threatening. So think about how media, pornography, and societal expectations shape our perceptions of what's normal or desirable when it comes to sex.
It's like we're all conditioned to respond to certain cues,
Right.
often without even realizing it.
Exactly. And this brings us to this concept of individual differences in sensitivity to those brakes and accelerators.
Okay.
So some people have a very sensitive SES, meaning their brakes are easily triggered,
Okay.
while others have a more dominant SES, making them more responsive to those, sexually relevant cues.
So it's not just about being in the mood,
Right.
but about understanding the unique interplay of these systems within each person.
Exactly. And Nagoski uses two examples from her students to kind of
Okay.
illustrate this. Olivia, who has a very active SES, is described as one big yes to sex. And then Camilla, who's intellectually curious about sex, but has like a low level of desire, potentially due to a more sensitive SIS, it shows how these differences can play out in very real ways.
But it's not just individual differences at play, right?
Right.
Nagoski talks a lot about the importance of context.
Context is everything. She compares it to tickling. The same sensation can be perceived as pleasurable or annoying depending on who's doing it, your relationship with them, and the overall situation.
Yeah.
Our sexual responses are so sensitive to our environment, our emotional state, and even our relationship dynamics.
And this is where the stress response comes in.
Right, exactly.
If we're constantly stressed out, it's going to be much harder to relax and feel aroused.
Absolutely. Nagoski breaks down the stress response cycle into 3 stages: fight, flight, or freeze.
Right.
These are our like primal reactions to perceived threats, and they have a huge impact on our overall well-being, including our sexual responses.
So it's not just about avoiding stress, but also about having healthy ways to process and complete that stress cycle.
Exactly. Nagoski shares this anecdote about a student who helped her boyfriend through a panic attack by simply creating a sense of safety
Right.
and allowing him to just ride out the stress cycle. It highlights how crucial support and understanding can be in regulating our emotions, both in general and like within a sexual context.
Yeah, that makes sense. Speaking of regulation, let's talk about attachment styles.
Okay.
How do those early childhood experiences shape our adult relationships and sexual experiences?
Attachment is this fascinating biological mechanism that essentially programs us for connection. So, our early experiences with caregivers shape our attachment style, which then influences how we approach intimacy, trust, and vulnerability in adult relationships, including sexual ones.
So someone with a secure attachment style
Yeah.
might feel more comfortable with closeness and intimacy,
Right.
while someone with an anxious attachment style might seek validation or reassurance
Yes.
through sex.
That's a very common pattern. And then you have those with avoidant attachment styles who tend to distance themselves emotionally,
Right.
which can make it difficult to like connect deeply
Yeah.
with a partner.
It makes you realize how much of our adult behavior is rooted in those early experiences.
Right.
It's not just about our conscious choices, but about these deeper patterns that we often aren't even aware of.
Absolutely.
Now, let's talk about the cultural messages that can really mess with our heads when it comes to sex.
Okay.
Nagoski calls these the moral message, the medical message, and the media message. Can you elaborate on those?
These messages are so pervasive,
Yeah.
and they can be incredibly damaging to women's sexual well-being. So the moral message tells us that female sexuality is inherently bad or wrong, leading to shame, guilt, and a fear of even like exploring our desires.
Right.
And then you have the medical message, which like pathologizes normal variations in women's sexual responses,
Okay.
reinforcing the idea that there's one right way to experience sex.
It's like we're constantly being told that something is wrong with us if we don't fit into this narrow,
Yeah.
often unrealistic mold.
Exactly. And then you have the media message,
Right.
which just bombards us with images of unattainable beauty standards and sexual performance,
Oh, yeah.
setting us up for comparison and self-criticism.
It's no wonder so many women struggle with body image issues
Yeah.
and performance anxiety.
Yeah.
These messages are everywhere.
They are, and they contribute to this like pervasive problem of body self-criticism, which Nagoski argues is a major obstacle to sexual well-being. She even goes so far as to say that body self-criticism is more harmful to our health than our actual weight.
Oh, wow. That's a really powerful statement. It challenges us to rethink our priorities
Yeah.
and to focus on self-acceptance
Yeah.
rather than striving for some unattainable ideal.
Exactly. And it ties into the concept of health at every size, which emphasizes that health and well-being are achievable at any weight.
Okay.
It's about shifting our focus from weight loss to behaviors that promote overall well-being, like nutritious eating, enjoyable movement, and stress management.
It's about embracing our bodies as they are
Yes.
right now and
Yeah.
treating them with kindness and respect.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a radical act of self-love in a culture that constantly tells us we're not good enough.
Now, let's talk about a concept that can be quite confusing. Non-concordance.
Okay.
What does it mean when our bodies and minds don't seem to be on the same page when it comes to arousal?
Non-concordance is basically the disconnect between genital response and subjective arousal.
Okay.
In other words, you can be physically aroused without feeling turned on,
Right.
and vice versa.
So Nagoski shares an anecdote about a friend who is physically responding but not feeling into the situation.
Yeah.
It highlights how non-concordance can be confusing and even lead to misunderstandings about consent.
Exactly. It's crucial to remember that genital responses are just one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
They don't tell the whole story of desire or consent.
And this is where those dangerous myths about lubrication equaling arousal come in.
Right. The idea that if someone is wet, they must be turned on is simply not true.
Right.
And it can be especially harmful in the context of sexual assault. Nagoski criticizes 50 Shades of Grey for perpetuating this myth and potentially contributing to a distorted understanding of consent.
It's a reminder that we need to be mindful of the messages we're consuming
Right.
and to critically evaluate them
Yes.
through a lens of consent and respect.
Absolutely. Clear and enthusiastic communication is essential. Always. We can't rely on physical responses alone
Right.
to determine consent or desire.
And this leads us to another important concept, responsive desire.
Okay.
How does this challenge the traditional sex as a drive model?
Responsive desire suggests that arousal often precedes desire rather than the other way around.
Okay.
So instead of waiting for that spontaneous urge to have sex,
Right.
responsive desire suggests that we can actually cultivate desire
Okay.
by engaging in pleasurable activities.
So it's about being open to the experience.
Yes.
And allowing arousal to build naturally rather than forcing it.
Exactly. It's about shifting our focus from I have to want this to let's see what happens.
Yeah.
And this can be incredibly liberating for women who have internalized the message that they should always be ready and willing to have sex.
This is a game changer, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It takes the pressure off and allows us to approach intimacy with a sense of curiosity and exploration.
Right.
And this can be particularly helpful for couples with differing levels of desire.
Instead of viewing those discrepancies as a problem, you're suggesting they can be approached with a sense of understanding and a willingness to experiment.
Exactly. It's about communication, understanding each other's needs and preferences, and finding ways to create a shared experience that feels satisfying for both partners.
And that's such a powerful message. It takes the focus away from fixing a problem and instead encourages a more collaborative and compassionate approach to intimacy.
And that's what makes Nagoski's work so impactful. It's not just about understanding the science of sex, but about applying those insights and create a more fulfilling and joyful experience for ourselves and our partners.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, but there's still so much more to unpack in Come As You Are.
Yes.
Let's take a short break and come back to dive deeper into the practical applications of these concepts.
Well, welcome back.
Let's continue our deep dive into Emily Nagoski's Come As You Are. So we've been talking a lot about like the science and the psychology of women's sexuality. Now I'm curious to kind of explore how these concepts actually play out in real life, particularly when it comes to things like desire, arousal, and orgasm.
It's important to bridge that gap between like the theory and the experience.
Yeah.
And I think Nagoski does a really great job of that. She tackles some, pretty sensitive topics head on.
Right.
Challenging a lot of the cultural baggage that surrounds female sexuality.
Let's talk about orgasm for a minute. It's such a loaded topic. Yeah. Often portrayed as this like elusive goal that women should be striving for in every sexual encounter.
Right.
What does Nagoski have to say about that?
Well, she challenges that whole idea that orgasm during intercourse should be the ultimate goal.
Okay.
She points out that it's not the most common way for women to experience orgasm, and focusing solely on that can actually create a lot of pressure and anxiety.
So what is the most common way for women to achieve orgasm?
Clitoral stimulation is key for most women.
Got it.
Nagoski debunks the myth that women's orgasms are primarily for reproduction, suggesting that they're more of a byproduct of homology than like an adaptation for, baby making. She reframes them as sources of pleasure and connection in their own right.
That makes a lot of sense. And she emphasizes that difficulty with orgasm is common and nothing to be ashamed of.
Exactly. It's important to normalize those experiences and to encourage women to explore their own bodies without judgment or pressure.
And this is where the concept of meta-emotions comes in, right? Our feelings about our feelings can really impact our ability to experience pleasure.
Absolutely. If we're constantly judging ourselves or feeling anxious about our sexual responses, it's going to create a lot of internal tension. Nagoski advocates for what she calls emotion coaching, which involves acknowledging and accepting our emotions without judgment. It's about creating a sense of safety within ourselves so that we can explore our sexuality without fear or shame.
So how does that actually translate into practical advice for women who might be struggling with this?
Nagoski encourages women to pay attention to their bodies, to experiment with different types of touch and stimulation, and to really focus on what feels good in the moment. She also suggests seeking professional help if they're experiencing, persistent challenges with orgasm.
It's about giving ourselves permission to explore and to learn what brings us pleasure, without any like preconceived notions of what should be happening.
Totally. And it's important to remember that every woman's experience is unique. There's no right or wrong way to have an orgasm.
This reminds me of what we discussed earlier about non-concordance. That disconnect between physical arousal and subjective experience. How does that factor into the orgasm conversation?
Well, it highlights that, genital responses are just one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
We can't assume that just because someone is physically responding that they're enjoying the experience or giving consent.
And Nagoski criticizes 50 Shades of Grey for perpetuating this myth, suggesting that it potentially contributes to a distorted understanding of consent.
It's a really crucial point. Consent is about enthusiastic agreement, not just the presence of physical arousal.
So how can we create a more sex-positive context, both for ourselves and for our partners?
It starts with awareness. We need to be mindful of the messages we're internalizing. From society, the media, and even our own past experiences, it's about questioning those messages and choosing to believe in a more expansive and inclusive view of sexuality.
It's about recognizing that pleasure is a fundamental human right, not something we have to earn or deserve. And that includes exploring our own bodies through masturbation.
Absolutely. Nagoski encourages women to view masturbation as a form of self-care, a way to learn about their bodies and discover what feels good.
She provides some great tips for incorporating it into a busy schedule, even suggesting that women actually schedule me time for self-pleasure.
It's about prioritizing our own pleasure and recognizing that it's not selfish to do so.
Now let's talk about relationships. Nagoski emphasizes that healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, trust, and communication.
She highlights the importance of choosing partners who support our autonomy, our growth, and our right to pleasure.
And she provides some warning signs to watch out for, like controlling behavior, disrespect, and a lack of empathy.
Absolutely. And she also acknowledges that relationships can be challenging. And she offers guidance on navigating conflict, communicating effectively, and maintaining connection even when things get tough.
One thing she emphasizes is using I statements to express our needs and feelings, which can be so helpful in avoiding blame and defensiveness.
Absolutely. And it's about being willing to listen to our partner's perspective without judgment. It's about creating a safe space for vulnerability and honesty.
Nagoski encourages couples to approach conflict as an opportunity for growth rather than a sign of incompatibility. That's such a powerful reframing.
It's about recognizing that disagreements are inevitable in any relationship, but it's how we handle them that determines the health and longevity of the connection.
So how do we actually put this into practice? It's easy to talk about communication, but actually doing it can be quite challenging.
Nagoski suggests starting with small steps. Maybe it's just sharing something you enjoyed about your last sexual encounter, or expressing a curiosity about something you'd like to try. It's about building trust and intimacy over time.
And it's about being willing to be vulnerable, even if it feels scary or uncomfortable.
Vulnerability is the key to true intimacy. It's about letting our guard down and allowing ourselves to be seen and loved for who we truly are.
Now, I know we've touched on this a bit already, but I want to circle back to the concept of responsive desire. It's such a game changer for so many women who have been conditioned to believe that they need to be, like, in the mood before engaging in any sexual activity.
The responsive desire model suggests that we can actually cultivate desire by creating a context that feels safe, inviting, and pleasurable. It's about focusing on the sensations and letting arousal build naturally, rather than waiting for that elusive spark of spontaneous desire.
So it's about shifting our mindset from, I have to want this, to, let's see what happens.
Exactly.
And this can be incredibly liberating for women who have internalized the message that they should always be ready and willing to have sex.
Absolutely. It takes the pressure off and allows us to approach intimacy with a sense of curiosity and exploration.
Nagoski encourages us to be more mindful during sexual experiences. To pay attention to what feels good in the moment and to communicate our needs and desires to our partners.
She also talks about the importance of slowing down. Of savoring the sensations and allowing arousal to build gradually.
This reminds me of something she said about the brain having a little monitor that's constantly evaluating our effort to progress ratio when it comes to achieving our goals. Can you elaborate on that?
It's this fascinating concept called criterion velocity. So Nagoski uses examples like driving in traffic or working on a challenging project to illustrate how this little monitor impacts our everyday experiences. She suggests that when we feel like we're making good progress, our motivation and desire increase.
Okay.
But when we feel stuck or like we're not making any headway,
Right.
our desire just plummets.
So how does this apply to sex?
If we're constantly feeling pressured or like we're not meeting our own or our partner's expectations, our desire for sex is likely to decrease.
Yeah.
But when we create a context that feels safe, pleasurable, and focused on connection, our desire can flourish.
Makes sense. If we're feeling anxious or self-conscious,
Yeah.
it's going to be much harder to relax and enjoy the experience.
Yeah.
But if we can shift our focus to pleasure and connection,
Right.
it can create a much more positive feedback loop.
Exactly. And this is where communication comes in again.
Right.
Being able to talk openly with our partners
Yeah.
about our needs, desires, and boundaries
Yeah.
can create a much more supportive and enjoyable sexual experience for everyone involved.
It's about creating a shared experience that feels good for both partners, rather than trying to meet some arbitrary standard of performance.
And this brings us back to the idea of self-care. Taking care of our physical, emotional, and mental well-being
Right.
is essential for a healthy and fulfilling sex life.
Nagoski encourages us to prioritize activities that nourish our bodies, minds, and spirits.
This might include things like getting enough sleep,
Right.
eating nutritious foods,
Yeah.
moving our bodies in ways that feel good,
Yeah,
spending time in nature,
for sure.
connecting with loved ones, and engaging in creative pursuits.
It's about recognizing that our sexual well-being
Yeah.
is intertwined with our overall well-being. We can't compartmentalize these aspects of our lives.
Exactly. And it's about giving ourselves permission to say no to things that drain our energy
Right.
and to make time for things that bring us joy and fulfillment.
It's about creating a life that supports our sexual well-being,
Yeah.
rather than expecting sex to magically fix everything that's wrong in our lives.
It's about recognizing that we have the power to create a more fulfilling and joyful sexual experience for ourselves,
Yeah.
starting right now, just as we are.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into Come As You Are. Let's take another short pause and then wrap things up with some final takeaways and reflections.
Yeah.
Okay, we're back. And I have to say, this deep dive into Come As You Are has been incredibly insightful. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of what this book has to offer.
It is. It's like packed with so much valuable information. It's hard to cover everything in just one conversation.
Holy, yeah.
But I think we've hit on like some of the most important takeaways,
Yeah.
especially like the emphasis on self-compassion, communication, and creating a more sex-positive context, for ourselves and our partners.
Those are such crucial elements
Yeah.
for a healthy and fulfilling sexual experience. And I love how Nagoski doesn't just present these ideas in a theoretical way.
Right.
She offers practical tools and techniques
Mm-hmm.
that we can actually use in our daily lives.
Yeah. That's what makes her work so accessible and empowering. She gives us permission to let go of all of those societal expectations and just embrace our unique sexual selves.
Speaking of practical tools, I'm curious to hear more about the techniques that she suggests for cultivating desire and arousal.
Okay.
We talked about responsive desire.
Yeah.
But what are some specific things that women can do to create that sense of openness and receptivity?
Nagoski talks a lot about the importance of mindfulness. It's about paying attention to the present moment without judgment.
Okay.
Just noticing our thoughts, feelings, and sensations without getting swept away by them.
Yeah.
This can be particularly helpful in a sexual context because it allows us to be fully present with our partners and to savor the experience.
So instead of worrying about whether we're doing it right or whether we're going to have an orgasm,
Exactly.
we can shift our focus to the actual sensations and emotions that we're experiencing in the moment.
And that can be incredibly powerful in enhancing pleasure and connection. Nagoski also suggests engaging in activities that stimulate the senses.
Okay.
So this might involve things like taking a warm bath, listening to music, or using scented oils.
It's about creating an environment that feels inviting and pleasurable,
Yeah.
both for ourselves and for our partners.
And it's about being intentional about setting aside time for intimacy and connection. In today's busy world, it's easy to let those things fall by the wayside.
Right.
But scheduling time for sex, even if it feels a bit unromantic at first, can actually be so helpful in prioritizing those needs.
It's like scheduling a date night.
Yeah.
But for intimacy.
Exactly.
And it can take the pressure off of waiting for that spontaneous moment of desire to strike.
Right. It allows us to approach intimacy with a sense of intention and anticipation, which can actually enhance desire and arousal.
Now, we've talked a lot about women's experiences, but I'm wondering how men can apply these concepts as well. After all, healthy sexuality is about partnership and mutual understanding.
Nagoski actually addresses this directly in the book.
Okay.
She encourages men to, educate themselves about women's anatomy and sexual responses. She also stresses the importance of communication, listening to their partners, and being willing to, experiment and try new things.
It's about moving away from those rigid gender roles and expectations.
Yeah.
And creating a more egalitarian and collaborative approach to intimacy.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that everyone's experience is unique. What works for one person might not work for another, and that's okay. The key is to be open-minded, respectful, and willing to, learn and grow together.
So what would you say are the most important takeaways from Come As You Are? What do you hope listeners will carry with them from this deep dive?
I think the most important message is that you are normal, no matter your individual experiences, desires, or challenges. There's no one right way to experience sex, and variation is not only natural, but to be celebrated.
It's about embracing our bodies and our sexuality with compassion and curiosity, and letting go of those shame-based messages that have been holding us back.
And it's about recognizing that we have the power to create a more fulfilling and joyful sexual experience for ourselves, starting right now, just as we are. It might involve challenging cultural myths, cultivating self-compassion, communicating openly with our partners, and prioritizing pleasure and self-care in our lives, but it's a journey worth taking.
It's about reclaiming our sexuality as a source of pleasure, connection, and empowerment.
Yeah.
Rather than viewing it as something to be feared or controlled.
Exactly. It's about embracing the full spectrum of human experience with all its complexities and variations.
Well, I think that's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Emily Nagoski's Come As You Are. We hope this conversation has sparked some new insights and inspired you to continue exploring your own journey of sexual self-discovery.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, you are not alone on this journey. There are resources available, communities to connect with, and professionals who can support you along the way. Embrace your unique sexuality, celebrate your body, and never stop exploring what feels good.
And until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep coming as you are.